Early life and childhood 1965–1982. Joanne Rowling, who would one day become the world-famous author known as J.K. Rowling, was born on July 31, 1965, in Yate, a small town just outside of Bristol, England. Her arrival was not into a world of wealth, glamour, or privilege. She was the first daughter of Peter Rowling, an aircraft engineer at Rolls-Royce, and Anne Rowling, a kind-hearted science technician. Later, her younger sister, Diane D., was born when Joanne was not yet 2 years old. The Rowling family lived an ordinary, working-class life. They were not poor, but neither were they rich. They had enough to get by, and their home was filled with the everyday struggles of a typical British family in the late 1960s and 1970s. But inside their eldest daughter's imagination, something extraordinary was brewing. From an early age, Joanne loved stories. She adored reading and would consume every book she could get her hands on. Her parents introduced her to classic children's tales, but it was C.S. Lewis' The Chronicles of Narnia that truly ignited her imagination. Books were not just entertainment. For Joanne, they were doors into magical worlds, escapes from the ordinary. She was not only a reader but also a writer. At the age of 6, she wrote her very first story, about a rabbit who got measles and was visited by his friends, including a giant bee named Miss B. To most, it was a simple, childlike story. But to Anne Rowling, her daughter's imagination was remarkable. She encouraged Joanne to keep writing, to never stop dreaming. That encouragement planted a seed that would carry Joanne through decades of hardship. By 11, Joanne was writing longer tales. She created a story called The 7 Cursed Diamonds, and she filled notebooks with sketches of characters and magical adventures. Even at this young age, she displayed the traits of a true storyteller: persistence, creativity, and a love for crafting entire worlds. But not everything in Joanne's childhood was easy. Her relationship with her father was distant and strained. She often felt misunderstood by him, and this lack of closeness would leave emotional scars that she carried into adulthood. At the same time, her bond with her mother was deep and nurturing. Anne's kindness, warmth, and constant support became Joanne's emotional anchor. School life presented its own challenges. Joanne attended St. Michael's Primary School and later Whiting School. She was a bright and curious student, especially passionate about English and languages. Teachers often described her as dreamy, her head always in the clouds, lost in stories. She was not the top student academically, but she possessed a gift that could not be measured by exams: the ability to imagine beyond reality. At school, Joanne also faced teasing and moments of isolation. Her self-image was fragile, and she sometimes felt invisible. These early experiences of being misunderstood, underestimated, and even bullied would later inspire the characters in Harry Potter: the misfits, the underdogs, the children who felt out of place but discovered they had extraordinary strength within. A significant turning point came when Joanne was a teenager. Her mother, Anne, was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, a degenerative disease that slowly weakens the body. The news devastated Joanne. Watching her once energetic and supportive mother fall ill was heartbreaking. The illness placed a shadow over the Rowling household, and Joanne's teenage years became colored by grief, fear, and uncertainty. Despite the pain, Joanne never stopped writing. In fact, writing became her escape. She filled notebooks with stories, finding comfort in the worlds she created. These private creations gave her a sense of control in a life that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. She may not have known it then, but her ability to transform pain into creativity was one of her greatest strengths. By the time she finished high school, Joanne dreamed of studying at Oxford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. She applied, full of hope, but was rejected. For a girl who had always been told her dreams were impractical, this was another painful blow. Instead, she attended the University of Exeter, where she studied French and classics. At first, Joanne felt disappointed. Oxford had been her dream. But Exeter provided her with something just as valuable: exposure to literature, mythology, and storytelling traditions from around the world. She studied ancient myths, learned about Greek and Roman heroes, and discovered how old stories could be retold for new generations. Without realizing it, she was gathering the raw materials that would later shape Harry Potter. Even as a university student, Joanne never stopped writing. She filled scraps of paper with ideas, scenes, and conversations between imaginary characters. While her classmates were preparing for careers in business, teaching, or law, Joanne clung to her unpractical dream of being a writer. She graduated from Exeter, but the path forward was unclear. She tried various jobs: secretary, teacher, researcher, but none satisfied her. Joanne felt restless, searching for purpose, longing to create. She knew she was meant for something more, though she couldn't yet see what it was. By the early 1980s, Joanne Rowling was a young woman standing at the crossroads of life. She had an education, but no clear career. She had talent, but little direction. She had dreams, but also doubts. And yet, deep inside, she carried the one thing that would eventually transform her life: the unshakable passion to tell stories. Little did she know that in just a few years, on a seemingly ordinary train journey, the story that would change her life, and the lives of millions, would appear in her mind like magic. University years and the birth of Harry Potter idea, 1983-1990. By the early 1980s, Joanne Rowling had stepped into a new world. She left her hometown behind and entered the University of Exeter, where she studied French and classics. For many young people, university is a time of freedom, discovery, and new opportunities. For Joanne, it was all that, but also a time of quiet struggle. Exeter was far from the dream of Oxford, which she had once hoped for. Yet, in hindsight, Exeter was exactly where she needed to be. Here, she encountered ancient myths, legends, and classical stories that fed her imagination. She read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, studied Latin and Greek, and explored tales of gods, heroes, and epic journeys. These old myths would later echo through her own writing: the battle of good versus evil, the presence of magical creatures, and the idea that even the smallest hero can change the world. But life at Exeter was not glamorous. Joanne often felt like an outsider. She worked hard enough to get through classes, but her true passion wasn't French grammar or classical translations, it was storytelling. She spent hours scribbling in notebooks, writing down snippets of dialogue, and inventing characters. She admitted years later that she was not the most focused student. Instead of revising for exams, she often lost herself in the imaginary worlds she was building in her head. After graduating in 1986, Joanne faced the harsh reality of adulthood. She had a degree, but no clear path. She tried her hand at various jobs: a researcher, a secretary, and later, a bilingual secretary at Amnesty International in London. None of these roles fulfilled her. She was known in the office as a daydreamer, someone whose mind was elsewhere. She often thought of herself as a failure because she wasn't climbing a career ladder like her peers. But what she didn't yet realize was that her daydreams were her true gift. During this time, Joanne continued to write in her spare hours. She worked on novels that never saw the light of day, stories that remained unfinished. To her, it sometimes felt hopeless, like she was wasting time. Yet, every word she wrote was sharpening her skills, preparing her for the masterpiece that was waiting to be born. Then, in 1990, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. One summer day, Joanne boarded a train from Manchester to London's King's Cross station. It was an ordinary journey, until the train was delayed. Staring out of the window, lost in thought, an idea suddenly struck her with stunning clarity. She saw a boy who didn't know he was a wizard. A boy who discovered his true identity when he entered a world of magic. I had been writing almost continuously since the age of 6, Joanne later recalled, but I'd never been so excited about an idea before. It came in flashes, and by the end of that train ride, many of the characters and details were fully formed in my mind. It wasn't just Harry Potter she saw. She saw Hogwarts, the enchanted castle where young witches and wizards would study. She saw professors, spells, magical creatures, and the looming shadow of a dark villain. By the time the train finally arrived at King's Cross, Joanne felt transformed. There was just one problem: she didn't have a pen with her. For 4 hours, she sat in her seat, terrified she might forget something, as the story unfolded in her imagination like a movie. But she didn't forget. That evening, she began scribbling down everything she had seen in her mind. For the first time, she felt that she was holding an idea that was too big, too powerful, to ignore. But even as her imagination soared, her real life was collapsing. Later that year, Joanne's world was shaken to its core when her beloved mother, Anne Rowling, passed away after a long battle with multiple sclerosis. Joanne was devastated. She had always been closest to her mother, and losing her felt like losing the foundation of her life. Her grief was so deep that it seeped into her writing. Harry Potter's longing for his parents, the theme of death and loss, and the idea that love could survive even after death, all of these were reflections of Joanne's own pain. With her mother gone and her heart broken, Joanne sought escape. She took a job teaching English in Portugal, hoping for a fresh start in a foreign country. It seemed like a chance to rebuild her life, but little did she know that her next chapter would bring even more challenges. Still, she carried with her a battered suitcase, filled with notebooks and drafts. Among those notes lay the first scribbles of a boy wizard named Harry Potter, waiting to come alive. At this point, Joanne Rowling was not yet a famous writer. She was not yet wealthy, celebrated, or admired. She was a young woman in her 20s, uncertain about the future, still grieving, and still struggling. And yet, she carried a story in her heart that would one day touch the lives of millions. Sometimes, the greatest dreams are born on the most ordinary days. And for Joanne Rowling, one delayed train ride had just changed everything. The loss of her mother in Portugal years 1990–1993. In late 1990, just as the idea of Harry Potter had come alive in Joanne Rowling's imagination, her world was struck by a devastating blow. Her beloved mother, Anne Rowling, passed away at only 45 years old after a long battle with multiple sclerosis. For Joanne, the loss was unbearable. She had always shared a deep bond with her mother, and Anne had been her greatest supporter. The timing of her mother's death made the pain even sharper. Joanne had already begun sketching out the world of Harry Potter, but her mother never knew anything about it. Anne never saw her daughter's dream take shape. This regret haunted Joanne for years. She later admitted that her grief poured into her writing. Harry's longing for his parents, the deep theme of loss that runs through the series, and the idea that love can survive death, all were born from Joanne's broken heart. Searching for escape, Joanne made a bold decision. She left England and took a job teaching English as a foreign language in Portugal. To her, it seemed like a fresh start, an adventure that could distract her from her grief. In 1991, she moved to the coastal city of Porto, where she began her new life as an English teacher. Portugal was beautiful, but Joanne's inner life remained stormy. By day, she taught enthusiastic students. By night, she continued to write. She carried notebooks everywhere, filling them with details about Harry Potter's world, Hogwarts, Quidditch, magical spells, and the friends who would one day accompany Harry on his journey. In Portugal, the wizarding world continued to grow in her imagination, even as her real life grew complicated. It was in Porto that Joanne met Jorge Arantes, a Portuguese journalist. Their romance began quickly, and within a short time, they married. At first, Joanne hoped that marriage would bring stability and happiness. But the relationship soon turned turbulent. Their personalities clashed, and arguments became frequent. What had started as a hopeful union quickly turned into a troubled marriage. Amidst the storm, Joanne gave birth to her daughter, Jessica Isabel Rowling Arantes, in 1993. Becoming a mother was one of the brightest moments in her life. Joanne adored her baby girl and poured her love and energy into caring for her. She named Jessica after her favorite author, Jessica Mitford, a rebellious writer whom Joanne admired deeply. But while Joanne loved being a mother, her marriage continued to deteriorate. The relationship with Jorge grew increasingly unstable, and within a short time, the marriage collapsed. Joanne found herself alone, separated, and responsible for raising a newborn baby. By late 1993, Joanne made another life-changing decision. She left Portugal with baby Jessica and returned to the United Kingdom. Carrying 2 suitcases, her daughter, and a manuscript of Harry Potter, she arrived in Edinburgh, Scotland, seeking safety and a fresh start. But what awaited her was not comfort or stability, it was hardship. Back in the UK, Joanne was unemployed, divorced, grieving her mother's death, and struggling to raise her daughter alone. She had no money, and she had to rely on state benefits to survive. In her own words, she was as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. From the outside, It looked as though Joanne had hit rock bottom. She was a single mother, living on welfare, with no job, no husband, and little support. Many would have given up on their dreams in such circumstances. But Joanne held on to the one thing that gave her hope, her story. Even during her hardest days in Portugal, she had continued to write Harry Potter. She carried with her the early chapters of the first book, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Now, back in Scotland, she clung to it like a lifeline. Joanne's Portugal years had been a mix of love, loss, and struggle. She had lost her mother, endured a failed marriage, and become a single mother at a young age. Yet, she had also gained something precious, her daughter Jessica, and the determination to bring Harry Potter's story to life. What the world saw as failure, Joanne would later describe as the foundation of her success. As she herself put it, struggles as a single mother in Edinburgh, 1993-1995. When Joanne Rowling arrived back in Edinburgh in late 1993 with her infant daughter Jessica, she had little more than 2 suitcases, a typewriter, and a partially written manuscript of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. From the outside, she looked defeated, a divorced single mother, unemployed, and living on state benefits. Yet inside her, a story was burning so strongly that even the harshest conditions could not put it out. Life in Edinburgh was painfully hard. Joanne had no stable income, and the small government welfare she received barely covered rent and food. There were days she felt humiliated standing in line to collect her benefits, wondering how her life had spiraled into such hardship. At times, she felt like she had truly failed, not only herself, but also her daughter. She described herself as being as poor as it is possible to be in modern Britain without being homeless. Poverty weighed heavily on her, and she slipped into a period of clinical depression. The dark shadow of hopelessness crept into her life, whispering that she would never succeed, that she was destined to fail. She admitted that at one point, she even considered suicide. Yet, in the depths of despair, 2 things kept her alive, her daughter and her writing. Jessica gave her a reason to keep going, a reminder that she could not give up. And Harry Potter gave her purpose, a light in the darkness, a dream worth chasing even when everything else was falling apart. Writing became her survival. Since she couldn't afford childcare, Joanne often walked the streets of Edinburgh with her daughter in a stroller. When Jessica fell asleep, Joanne would slip into a cafe, order the cheapest coffee she could afford, and take out her notebook. One of her favorite places was Nicholson's Cafe, owned by her brother-in-law. There, surrounded by the noise of clinking cups and conversations, Joanne poured her imagination onto the page. She wrote about a boy who felt alone and unwanted, just as she sometimes felt. She gave him the courage to discover he was more powerful than he ever knew. She gave him friends who became family, mentors who guided him, and a world that welcomed him. In many ways, Harry Potter was her reflection, a child marked by tragedy but destined for greatness. Still, the practical difficulties were immense. She didn't own a computer. She typed drafts on an old manual typewriter, often retyping entire chapters just to make them neat enough to submit one day. She lived in a small, cramped apartment, and her heating bills were often too high to manage. Winters in Edinburgh were bitterly cold, and Joanne sometimes wrapped herself and Jessica in blankets because she couldn't afford enough heat. During this period, Joanne's depression inspired another creation, the Dementors, dark, soul-sucking creatures introduced later in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. She explained that Dementors were a direct metaphor for the way she felt in those years, drained of hope, paralyzed by despair. Through writing, she was not only building a magical world but also giving shape to her pain, transforming it into something creative. Despite her struggles, Joanne was determined. Every spare moment went into her manuscript. When Jessica was asleep at night, Joanne wrote. When she sat in cafes, she wrote. She lived in poverty, but she lived with purpose. Her friends and family noticed her obsession with writing and sometimes worried that she was chasing an impossible dream. But Joanne refused to give up. She believed in Harry Potter even when no one else did. By 1995, after years of persistence, she completed the manuscript of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. It was a thick stack of typed pages, the product of endless nights, cups of coffee, and sheer determination. For Joanne, finishing the book was an enormous victory. She had survived heartbreak, poverty, and depression, and yet she had created something extraordinary. Now came the next challenge: finding a publisher. Joanne knew it wouldn't be easy. The publishing industry was notoriously competitive, and she was an unknown, unemployed single mother with no literary connections. But she also knew that Harry Potter was special. She believed children would fall in love with the story just as she had. With hope and fear in equal measure, she began to send the manuscript to literary agents and publishers. She bought a second-hand binder, placed the neatly typed pages inside, and mailed them out, one by one, bracing herself for rejection. What followed was a series of doors slammed in her face. But Joanne was no stranger to failure. She had been rejected before, by Oxford, by life circumstances, by fate itself. And yet, she had learned to stand up again. As she sent out her manuscript, waiting for answers, she had no idea that the world was about to change, not just for her, but for millions of readers around the globe. The boy who lived was about to step out of her imagination and into history.